What if a failed artist and broken WWI veteran could manipulate an entire nation into following him toward global catastrophe? What if democracy itself could be legally dismantled by the very people sworn to protect it? What if the seeds of the world's most devastating war were planted not on battlefields, but in the desperate hearts of ordinary citizens? This is the story of how Adolf Hitler rose from obscurity to absolute power, and it's a warning that democracy is never as safe as we think. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany humiliated, economically devastated, and politically unstable. We explored how that flawed peace agreement created conditions for resentment and extremism to flourish. But what if that peace treaty didn't just punish Germany? What if it created the perfect conditions for a new kind of political leader to emerge? A leader who would transform a broken nation into an aggressive military power, setting the stage for the world's most devastating conflict. Welcome back to Reality of Battlefields and our series Untold War Stories. I'm your host, and in this episode, we'll examine how fear, economic hardship, and political instability combined in post-war Germany to enable the rise of one of history's most studied political figures. This is not just the story of Adolf Hitler, it's the story of how democratic institutions can become vulnerable to authoritarian movements, and how ordinary people can be drawn to extremist political solutions during times of crisis. Germany in 1919 was not simply defeated militarily, it was fundamentally transformed politically, economically, and socially. The Treaty of Versailles had created lasting problems throughout German society. Reparations payments strained the national economy. Food shortages affected daily life. Veterans returned from WWI battlefields to find limited employment opportunities and social recognition. The Kaiser had abdicated, the monarchy was dissolved, and in its place emerged a new democratic system, the Weimar Republic. However, for many Germans, this new democracy appeared associated with national weakness and international humiliation. Street confrontations occurred between communist and nationalist groups. Labor strikes disrupted industrial production. Hyperinflation reached extreme levels, particularly by 1923, when currency values collapsed so completely that families needed wheelbarrows of banknotes to purchase basic necessities. One German citizen later recalled, "My family had saved for decades to purchase a home. When we finally withdrew our savings, the money was sufficient only for a week's groceries." These conditions created an environment where extremist political movements could attract popular support. Among those profoundly affected by Germany's defeat was a WWI veteran named Adolf Hitler. Hitler had served as a messenger during World War I, participating in multiple battles and receiving military decorations, including the Iron Cross, first class, an unusual honor for someone of his military rank. When the war concluded, he was recovering in a military hospital from gas exposure. Learning of Germany's surrender there, he experienced what he later described as a profound personal and national crisis. This moment shaped his political worldview and his interpretation of Germany's defeat. 1. The rise of Hitler began with a veteran who struggled to accept his nation's military defeat. He embraced popular conspiracy theories, including the stab in the back myth, a false but emotionally powerful claim that Germany's military had not been defeated in combat, but had been undermined by political betrayal at home. This resentment became the foundation of his political motivation. In 1919, while seeking political purpose, Hitler attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, a small nationalist political organization. Their discussions about national revival, opposition to the Versailles Treaty, and blame for Germany's problems resonated with his personal experiences and beliefs. Hitler soon discovered his most significant political skill, public speaking. He could address audiences for extended periods without written notes, using emotional appeals and dramatic gestures to connect with listeners' fears and frustrations. One early observer noted, "He seemed to understand what people were thinking and gave voice to feelings they had not expressed openly." By 1920, the German Workers' Party had adopted a new name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Hitler had become one of its primary leaders and most effective speakers. Hitler's ambitions led to direct action. In November 1923, in Munich, he and his supporters attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The plan involved seizing local government buildings and inspiring a national uprising against the Weimar Republic. The attempt failed completely. Law enforcement intervened, resulting in casualties among the participants. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to prison. Initially, this appeared to end his political career. However, the trial provided him with national media attention and a platform to present his political ideas to a broader German audience. He portrayed himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot being punished for his dedication to Germany. During his imprisonment, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which combined autobiographical elements with his political philosophy. The book outlined his beliefs about German nationalism, his opposition to democratic government, and his theories about racial and cultural superiority. Most political observers at the time dismissed the book as the writings of a fringe radical. Few recognized it as a detailed outline of his future political and military objectives. When Hitler was released from prison in 1924, Germany was experiencing a period of relative economic and political stability. Foreign investment and improved governance had helped the Weimar Republic achieve temporary recovery. Extremist political movements, including the Nazi Party, received limited public support during this period. However, this stability proved temporary. The Great Depression began in 1929 and affected Germany more severely than most other nations. American investments ceased, factories closed, and unemployment reached approximately 6 million people by 1932, nearly one-third of the German workforce. Economic desperation returned to levels not seen since the early 1920s. The Nazi Party exploited these conditions effectively. Their political messaging promised employment, national pride, and rejection of the Versailles Treaty restrictions. Their propaganda presented images of economic prosperity, social unity, and international respect, while simultaneously promoting fear of political opponents and minority groups. In the 1928 parliamentary elections, the Nazi Party received only 2.6% of the national vote. By 1932, they had become the largest party in the German parliament. Hitler had transformed from a marginal political figure into a national leader. January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany through legal democratic procedures. However, the Chancellor position was insufficient for Hitler's political objectives. Within weeks of becoming Chancellor, Hitler began consolidating political power. When the Reichstag building, Germany's parliament, was damaged by fire, Hitler used the incident to justify emergency measures. He requested special powers to protect the nation from perceived threats. The Reichstag fire decree suspended constitutional protections for freedom of speech, press, and assembly. Political opponents were detained, and normal legal procedures were bypassed. A month later, the Enabling Act was passed through a combination of political pressure and intimidation. This legislation granted Hitler the authority to govern through executive decrees, effectively ending parliamentary democracy in Germany. Hitler continued consolidating power by eliminating potential rivals within his own movement. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 involved the arrest and execution of SS Stormtrooper leaders who might have challenged his authority. This action also secured support from the German military, who had been concerned about SA influence. When President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler merged the positions of Chancellor and President, taking the title Führer leader. The transition from democratic politician to authoritarian dictator was complete. Hitler immediately began violating the Versailles Treaty restrictions. Military production resumed, aircraft manufacturing expanded, and military formations were reorganized. These actions were popular among Germans, who felt their nation had been unfairly restricted by the peace treaty. Propaganda became a central tool of governance, influencing education, media, and cultural activities. Youth organizations were established to shape the next generation's political beliefs. Hitler's image and message became omnipresent in German society through posters, radio broadcasts, and public events. The transformation was remarkable. A World War I veteran who had felt powerless and resentful had become the undisputed leader of one of Europe's most powerful nations. International leaders initially underestimated Hitler's long-term objectives and military capabilities. Britain and France hoped that diplomatic engagement and limited concessions might prevent another major European conflict. The United States remained focused on domestic economic recovery and avoided extensive involvement in European affairs. Many international observers dismissed Hitler's aggressive rhetoric as political theater designed for domestic audiences. However, Hitler had already outlined his expansionist objectives in Mein Kampf. He intended not simply to restore Germany's pre-war status, but to achieve territorial expansion and establish German dominance in Europe. The rise of Hitler demonstrates several important historical lessons about democratic vulnerability to authoritarian movements. Economic crisis. Severe economic hardship can make populations receptive to extremist political solutions. Institutional weakness. Democratic institutions require active defense and cannot survive through legal procedures alone. Political complacency. Established political parties often underestimate extremist movements until they become too powerful to contain easily. International indifference. External democracies may fail to recognize threats until they become immediate security challenges. Hitler's rise was not historically inevitable, but once economic crisis, political instability, and social resentment combined, his ascent to power became increasingly difficult to prevent. By the late 1930s, Hitler had transformed Germany from a defeated, economically struggling democracy into an authoritarian state with expanding military capabilities. His political success was built on promises of national renewal, economic recovery, and international respect, promises that required continuous expansion to maintain. Hitler's political movement had succeeded by channeling popular frustrations into support for increasingly aggressive policies. However, his ultimate objectives extended far beyond Germany's borders and would inevitably lead to military conflict with other European powers. The World War II origins can be traced directly to the political and social conditions that enabled Hitler's rise to power. The failed peace settlement after World War I, the economic instability of the 1920s and 1930s, and the weakness of democratic institutions created opportunities for extremist movements to gain power through seemingly legal means. Understanding this historical progression helps us recognize warning signs of democratic vulnerability and the importance of addressing economic hardship, political polarization, and institutional weakness before they can be exploited by authoritarian movements. Hitler's transformation from WWI veteran to dictator illustrates how individual resentment, when combined with broader social and economic problems, can become a powerful political force capable of reshaping entire nations and threatening international stability. By 1939, Hitler had consolidated power domestically and begun implementing his expansionist agenda internationally. The stage was set for a conflict that would surpass World War I in scale, intensity, and global impact. The rise of Hitler serves as a critical historical case study for understanding how democratic societies can become vulnerable to authoritarian takeover. Key factors that contributed to this transformation included economic instability, the hyperinflation of the 1920s and mass unemployment of the 1930s created conditions where extremist political solutions became attractive to desperate populations. Political polarization. The Weimar Republic was characterized by intense political divisions that prevented effective governance and made democratic institutions appear weak and ineffective. Institutional fragility. Democratic legal procedures were used to eliminate democracy itself, demonstrating that constitutional protections require active defense and cannot survive on legal frameworks alone. International neglect. Other democratic nations failed to recognize the threat posed by Hitler's regime until it was too late to prevent through diplomatic means. Popular complacency. Many Germans initially supported Hitler because they believed he would restore economic stability and national pride, without fully understanding the implications of authoritarian rule. These historical lessons remain relevant for contemporary democratic societies, highlighting the importance of maintaining strong institutions, addressing economic inequality, and remaining vigilant against extremist political movements. The story of Hitler's rise reminds us that democracy is not a permanent achievement, but requires ongoing commitment and protection. Understanding how authoritarian movements gain power helps us recognize warning signs and take preventive action to preserve democratic institutions and values. Once Hitler had consolidated power and launched World War II, battles were not fought only with tanks and aircraft, they were also fought with intelligence, deception, and psychological warfare. In our next episode of Untold War Stories, we'll uncover Operation Mincemeat, one of the most ingenious deception operations in military history that helped change the course of World War II. We'll explore how British intelligence officers created a fictional person, complete with personal history and love letters, to mislead Hitler's military commanders about Allied invasion plans. We'll see how this elaborate hoax involved everything from theater makeup to convincing personal details that fooled German intelligence. Most importantly, we'll discover how this operation saved thousands of Allied lives and contributed to victory in one of World War II's most critical campaigns. The story demonstrates that in modern warfare, intelligence and deception can be as powerful as conventional military force, and how creative thinking can overcome seemingly impossible strategic challenges. The incredible true story of how a dead man helped win a war. That's our next exploration of the untold war stories that shaped history's outcome. This has been the reality of battlefields. If you found this examination of Hitler's rise to power educational, subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the untold stories that shaped our modern world. Because to understand our past is to prepare for our future.